I carried this secret my whole life, and it still follows me in my sleep.
In the early 2000s, doctors in rural Pennsylvania began noticing something deeply unsettling. Every child born into a small cluster of families was a twin. Every single one. Not occasionally. Not unusually often. 100% of the time. And when genetic testing was finally performed, the results were so extreme that the lead researcher refused to publish the full data. She would only say this: these people are no longer genetically distinct from one another. What no one outside those families knew was that this outcome was not an accident of nature. It was the result of a hidden decision made more than 300 years earlier, a decision based on faith, control, and the dangerous belief that human beings could perfect themselves through blood. For 13 generations, twins were forced to marry only twins. No outsiders, no exceptions. What began as a religious experiment slowly turned into a closed, genetic system that eventually collapsed under its own weight. And when the last generation was born, the consequences were no longer just spiritual or cultural. They were biological, psychological, and deadly. What they thought would bring them closer to God instead erased their individuality, their health, and in the end, their future. This is the true story of what happened when a family line tried to outsmart nature itself and paid a price no one could escape. To understand how something so extreme could survive for 13 generations, we have to return to colonial Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. At the time, this region was a magnet for religious refugees. Mennonites, Anabaptists, Pietists, and dozens of smaller sects settled the countryside west of Philadelphia, seeking isolation, freedom of belief, and distance from the control of Europe. Wooden farmhouses dotted the rolling fields. Church bells defined the rhythm of life. Scripture governed everything from marriage to medicine. It was in this world, thick with faith and fear, that the foundations of the twin bloodline were quietly laid. In the spring of 1703, a ship from Rotterdam arrived in the port of Philadelphia carrying German immigrants fleeing religious persecution. Among them were two 24-year-old identical twins from the Rhineland region, Johann and Lucas Schneider. Church registries from Germantown list their arrival date as April 11, 1703. They settled in what would later become Lancaster County, purchasing adjacent plots of farmland just beyond the edge of the growing colonial frontier. Johann was a lay preacher, deeply influenced by mysticism and numerology. Surviving fragments of his handwritten journals, now kept in the Pennsylvania State Archives, reveal a man obsessed with symmetry, duality, and what he repeatedly called the original design of mankind. He wrote that God created the universe in balanced pairs, light and dark, land and water, body and soul. To Johann, twins were not a biological coincidence. They were proof of divine intention. In 1708, both brothers married on the same day at the same church in Conestoga. Even the brides were twins, Clara and Martha Weiss, daughters of a strict Mennonite family known for their uncompromising obedience to religious authority. The double wedding was celebrated as a sign of blessing, but Johann believed it was something far greater. According to his private writings, this union marked the restoration of what was broken in Eden. Within 1 year, both couples produced twins. 4 infants were baptized on the same morning in August 1709. Parish records describe the event as joyful. No one yet saw danger in the symmetry. But Johann did not see coincidence where others did. To him, this was confirmation. What followed was not a public movement. There were no sermons about twins, no declarations made from the pulpit. Everything grew quietly inside families, behind barn doors and within whispered teachings passed from parent to child. Johann began corresponding with other rural families who had produced twins, encouraging them into private discussion about what he called a sacred alignment. The message was subtle but persistent. Twins were set apart by God, and their blood must not be diluted. By the 1730s, at least 9 interrelated families across Lancaster and Berks counties were following the same unspoken rule. Twins only married twins. Outsiders were discouraged, but never openly rejected. The language used was always gentle. This was not command, but destiny. Not law, but calling. Life on these farms was harsh and repetitive. Summers were heavy with humidity and the smell of manure. Winters were long, airless, and deadly quiet. Homes were lit by oil lamps. Children rose before dawn for chores and ended each day with prayer. News of the outside world arrived weeks late, if at all. In such isolation, tradition hardened quickly into truth. By the late 1700s, something extraordinary became impossible to ignore. The number of twin births among these families was growing far beyond statistical probability. Where neighboring farms saw twins once in a generation, these households saw them in nearly every pregnancy. Midwives recorded it. Doctors whispered about it. Pastors preached gratitude for it. Yet within the homes themselves, a different atmosphere was forming. Children were not encouraged to think of themselves as individuals. They were taught to think in pairs. They slept in the same beds, worked in the same fields, wore nearly identical clothes. Parents spoke of them not as two people, but as two halves of a single God-given form. To leave was unthinkable. To marry outside the twin circle was framed as spiritual abandonment. By the time the American Revolution erupted in 1775, the twin families barely felt its impact. Wars were political. Their covenant was eternal. And so the generations passed, each one more insulated than the last, each one more genetically enclosed, each one more convinced that what they were doing was sacred. What they didn't know was that with every perfectly mirrored marriage, they were tightening a biological trap that would one day snap shut with catastrophic force. Before we go further, ask yourself this. If you were born into a world where your identity, your marriage, and your future were already decided at birth, would you obey, or would you try to escape? Every long tragedy begins with people who believe they are doing the right thing. The twin covenant was no different. Its history is not driven by monsters, but by ordinary men and women whose choices slowly shaped something unrecognizable. Three figures in particular stand at the center of its rise. The first is the man who started everything. Johann Schneider, 1679-1746, was not born powerful. He was the son of a poor cooper in the Rhineland. Raised during a time of famine, war, and religious persecution, church records describe him as quiet, deeply devout, and painfully observant. As a boy, Johann and his identical twin brother Lucas were often mistaken for one another. Parish notes from 1691 describe them as inseparable to an unnerving degree. When one fell ill, the other would reportedly refuse food until his brother recovered. By the time Johann reached adulthood, this bond had transformed into theology. Surviving journal fragments reveal that he believed God had revealed a hidden truth to him through twinhood itself. That humanity was meant to exist in mirrored pairs, spiritually balanced and biologically preserved. To Johann, sin entered the world when unity was broken. Twins, he believed, were God's attempt to restore it. Publicly, Johann was calm, even gentle. Privately, his writings show absolute certainty. What is divided must be reunited, he wrote in 1706. The blood remembers what the soul has forgotten. His twin brother, Lucas Schneider, followed him not out of belief but out of loyalty. Lucas left no writings of his own. What we know of him comes from tax rolls, land deeds, and the letters of neighbors who described him as obedient, withdrawn, and deeply dependent on Johann's approval. If Johann was the architect of the covenant, Lucas was its silent foundation, the proof that a twin could surrender his will entirely to another. The second central figure emerges in the fourth generation, long after Johann's death. Margaret Weber, 1784-1849, was born a twin into the inner circle of the covenant and later married another twin at the age of 16. By the time she was 30, she had given birth to 5 sets of twins. Midwives described her pregnancies as unusually synchronized. Her children entered the world in near-perfect unison, often seconds apart. Margaret was widely respected among the families. She kept the birth ledgers. She oversaw marriages. She was the first woman to openly teach covenant doctrine to children as formal instruction, rather than parental guidance. Her home became the unofficial schoolhouse of the bloodline. Yet Margaret's private letters tell another story. In 1812, she wrote to her sister, "Sometimes I fear we are multiplying something broken. The children stare into mirrors longer than they look at people." A year later, her letters ceased entirely. According to church minutes, she suffered a spiritual crisis and withdrew from public life. But the instruction she established continued for generations. Whatever doubt she carried never weakened the system she helped build. The third figure appears much later, at the very edge of the covenant's collapse. Abraham Stoltz, 1899-1921, was part of the 9th generation. He and his twin brother Isaac were born on a farm outside Mannheim, Pennsylvania. School records described them as identical in height, weight, and handwriting. Teachers noted that they never spoke independently. One would begin a sentence. The other would finish it. When Abraham was drafted into World War I in 1918, it was the first forced separation of twin partners in the Covenant's history. Military medical files describe him as severely distressed upon departure. During training at Camp Meade, Maryland, Abraham began experiencing episodes of disorientation, panic, and violent self-harm. He told doctors that half of him had been ripped away. In one recorded incident, Abraham attempted to carve his brother's initials into his own chest with a razor. He was discharged as unfit for service 3 months later and sent home. He died less than 6 months after his return. His twin Isaac survived him by only 2 years. Together, these 3 lives trace the entire arc of the Covenant: the man who created it, the woman who institutionalized it, and the child who proved that separation had become biologically unbearable. And as you'll soon see, by the time the 10th generation was born, the Covenant no longer required belief at all. The blood itself had become the prison by the mid-1800s. The twin covenant no longer felt like a belief system. It felt like gravity. Every generation was pulled inward, tighter than the last. Outsiders still lived nearby, traded crops, passed on the roads. But emotionally and biologically, the twin families were sealing themselves off from the world. By 1843, county midwife records from Lancaster listed 22 twin births out of 24 total pregnancies within the Covenant farms. Local doctors quietly began to track the anomaly. One of them, Dr. Heinrich Vollmer, kept a private notebook that was discovered decades later in a descendant's attic. Inside were crude family trees showing the same surnames interlocking. Again and again, he wrote only one line in the margin: "The branches are folding back into the trunk." At first, the damage was subtle. Children were slower to speak. Some showed unusual emotional dependency. They panicked when physically separated from their twin. Parents described it as spiritual closeness. Doctors described it as pathological attachment. The families listened only to the men of faith. Then came 1871. That year, a young twin named Matthias Berger, age 17, disappeared 3 weeks before his arranged marriage to a set of twin sisters only 12 miles away. His family told neighbors he had gone west to look for work. But no train ticket was ever purchased. No letters were ever sent. His twin brother, Jonas, withdrew into near total silence after Matthias vanished. He would sit alone in the fields, whispering as if in conversation. Weeks later, Jonas told his mother that Matthias was not gone. He said his brother lived behind his eyes. Within 2 years, Jonas was dead. What they didn't know was that this would not be the last disappearance. By the 1870s and 1880s, visiting photographers were becoming popular across rural America. Families wanted formal portraits. One such photographer, Ernest Walden, documented several Covenant households in 1878. His studio notes, preserved in a private collection in Harrisburg, contain a strange observation. Difficult to distinguish sitters, faces identical beyond normal twin likeness, the eyes vacant, as if awaiting instruction. Walden never returned to the region. As the 7th generation matured, the psychological effects intensified. Children began reporting shared dreams, always the same dream. A white room, a mirror, a second self staring back. Some children woke screaming, convinced their twin had been injured, only for the injury to occur hours later. Doctors could not explain it. The families declared it proof of divine unity. By 1900, the Covenant families had quietly created a closed settlement pattern. Farms were purchased in clusters. Marriages were arranged exclusively within a 15-mile radius. Church services were no longer publicly announced. Census takers reported resistance and evasiveness. One enumerator wrote in 1900, "Every household contained pairs. Always pairs. Answers rehearsed. Movement restricted." Then came World War I, and for the first time, the Covenant could not control every separation. Between 1917 and 1919, 9 young men from Covenant families were drafted. Military doctors began documenting strange medical events almost immediately. Severe panic attacks upon separation, hallucinations involving their missing twin, syncing heart rhythms with siblings hundreds of miles away. One soldier collapsed during training in Maryland at the exact His twin broke a leg on the farm in Pennsylvania. The doctors labeled it hysteria. But what they didn't know was that something biological was now unraveling. By the 1920s, the 10th generation was being born, and the rate of twins had effectively reached 100%. Not one recorded singleton birth exists in the core covenant families after 1924. But the children were smaller, weaker. Many suffered from immune disorders. Respiratory failure became common before the age of 5. Still, the marriages continued. In 1928, the infamous group photograph was taken on a farm near Ephrata, Pennsylvania. 32 individuals, 13 generations represented in one frame. Every adult had once been a twin. Every child was currently a twin. When the photograph was later subjected to facial recognition, mapping in a modern study, the results showed near-identical biometrics across multiple generations. What they didn't know at the time was that this photo would become the last full visual record of the covenant at its height. From the 1930s to the 1950s, the outside world began pressing closer. Teachers reported synchronized behavior in covenant children. A school teacher in 1934 wrote that 2 twin girls drew the same picture in perfect unison in different rooms. Social workers requested home visits. Many were denied entry. In 1952, a local pastor, Reverend Paul Lind, confronted one of the patriarchs, warning him that the marriages were medically dangerous and spiritually corrupt. 3 days later, the pastor was found disoriented on the side of a dirt road, unable to remember the previous week. No charges were filed. The visit was never spoken of again. By the 1960s, the 11th generation showed undeniable signs of collapse, severe developmental delays, extreme social withdrawal, inability to function independently from the twin partner. Hospitals recorded repeated admissions for what doctors called mirror trauma, injuries appearing without cause after the other twin was harmed elsewhere. And still, no one outside the families truly understood what was happening. What they didn't know was that the most terrifying phase of the experiment had only just begun. Before we continue, let me ask you this. If you were a doctor or teacher seeing these signs in secretive rural families, would you push harder, or would fear make you look away? Because in the next phase of this story, the truth finally breaks the surface, and what is revealed is far darker than anyone was prepared to face. The truth did not surface all at once. It leaked out in fragments, through hospital records, abandoned files, and one quiet investigation that nearly disappeared with the people it exposed. In 1987, a pediatric neurologist named Dr. Eleanor Weiss was assigned to review a cluster of unusual childhood cases at Reading Hospital just outside Lancaster County. The patients all came from the same rural area. All suffered from synchronized psychological symptoms. Panic triggered by distant events, shared night terrors, mirrored injuries with no physical cause. And every single patient had one thing in common. They were twins. At first, Dr. Weiss suspected a reporting coincidence. Then she examined the family histories. What she found stunned her. Using church archives, birth registers, and county marriage records dating back to the early 1700s, she constructed a genealogical map. The deeper she went, the more impossible the pattern became. Line after line showed the same rule repeating across centuries: twins marrying twins, interlocking cousin lines, no genetic outsiders for generation after generation. By the time her chart reached the 13th generation, the branches no longer looked like branches at all. They looked like a spiral collapsing inward on itself. Dr. Weiss contacted a geneticist at Temple University, Dr. Marcus Haldane, and quietly requested advanced DNA testing from several patients under the guise of studying inherited autoimmune disorders. The results came back in 1989. They were unlike anything either scientist had ever seen. The patients showed extreme homozygosity across vast portions of their genomes, levels normally only observed after repeated, tightly controlled inbreeding in laboratory animals. But even those comparisons fell short. These children were not just inbred, they were becoming genetically interchangeable. Dr. Haldane wrote in an internal memo, "These genomes resemble iterative photocopies of the same original template." What they didn't know yet was how this had been deliberately engineered. That answer came in 1991, when an abandoned Mennonite church outside Lititz, Pennsylvania was scheduled for demolition. Behind a false wall in the basement, Workers uncovered a sealed wooden chest containing journals, ledgers, and correspondence dating back to 1706. Among them were the long-lost writings of Johann Schneider, the founder of the Covenant. The journals confirmed everything. Schneider had not merely observed twin births, he had designed the bloodline around them. His doctrine was explicit. Twins represented a divine correction to human division. Single births were viewed as spiritual fractures. From the beginning, his goal was not faith, it was replication. Generation after generation had been instructed to preserve the pattern at all costs. The most horrifying confirmation came from post-war medical files released under a limited Freedom of Information request. The documents detailed what military doctors had witnessed and separated twins during World War I and World War II, acute dissociative collapse, self-harm designed to restore the missing half. In one 1944 case, a soldier reportedly attempted to blind himself after learning his twin had lost an eye in a factory accident back home, despite having no physical contact. These were not symbolic responses. They were neurological. By the 1970s, cases multiplied. Children would arrive at emergency rooms screaming, in pain from injuries that did not exist, until their twins, miles away, were later injured in the same manner. Doctors coined the term mirror trauma syndrome, but quietly admitted they could not explain it. And then came the most devastating discovery of all. In 1994, hospital genetic screenings revealed that many children of the 12th generation were being born with failing immune systems, malformed neural pathways, and undeveloped psycho-emotional boundaries. Their brains struggled to form independent identity. Neurologists described their condition as a type of shared cognitive entanglement, two nervous systems functioning as reflections rather than individuals. The Covenant had not created spiritual unity. It had erased psychological separation. What they didn't know until it was too late was that identity itself was becoming non-viable. Runaways from the 12th generation confirmed it. Police reports from Philadelphia, 1992-1997, show multiple cases of young adults found disoriented, barefoot, searching for twins who were already dead. One young woman repeatedly told officers she could still feel her sister breathing through her chest. 2 years after the sister's fatal accident, every one of these individuals was returned to the farms. Every one of them vanished from public record afterward. When the 13th generation was born between 1998 and 2005, the Covenant reached its biological limit. The twin rate hit 100%. Developmental delays became nearly universal. Many children did not speak for years. When speech finally emerged, it often followed identical timing and identical phrasing between siblings. Doctors described their condition as biological convergence, the erosion of individual variants. And then in 2008, the final Covenant marriage took place. 2 twin brothers married 2 twin sisters in a sealed ceremony on a farm outside Blue Ball, Pennsylvania. Within 5 years, all 4 were dead. Official causes varied: heart failure, unexplained neurological collapse, sudden systemic infection. The pattern was unmistakable. The bloodline had reached total genetic closure. Dr. Weiss and Dr. Haldane prepared a full academic report in 2012. Only one redacted summary was ever published. The full findings remain sealed. In that summary, Dr. Weiss wrote a single sentence that still haunts modern researchers. This was not merely inbreeding. This was the systematic elimination of human difference. What the Covenant sought as perfection had become extinction. And in the next phase of this story, we see what happens when a secret meant to last forever finally collapses into the public world. By the time the 13th generation began to collapse, the damage was irreversible. The Twin Covenant did not end with a single raid, scandal, or courtroom revelation. It ended quietly, the way long secrets often do, through illness, disappearance, and a slow, deliberate erasure of evidence. After the final deaths in 2013 on the Blue Ball Farm, emergency responders filed routine reports. No criminal investigation followed. No public press conference was held. But behind the scenes, something changed. State health officials began cross-checking death certificates, hospital admissions, and sealed birth records dating back decades. For the first time, the pattern could no longer be ignored. What they found was devastating. Across the last 3 generations, the average life expectancy had dropped below 48 years. Infant mortality was nearly 6 times higher than the Pennsylvania rural average. Autoimmune collapse, sudden cardiac failure, and unexplained neurological shutdowns appeared again and again with no single environmental cause. The cause was already inside the blood. In 2014, a confidential task group was formed between the Pennsylvania Department of Health, Child Protective Services, and 2 university genetics departments. The group reviewed over 400 medical files connected to Covenant, descendants who had surfaced briefly in hospitals and psychiatric facilities before being quietly removed by family members. The conclusion was unanimous. Had this bloodline continued even 1 or 2 more generations, viable birth would likely have become impossible. The Covenant had nearly bred itself out of existence. What followed was not a rescue operation, it was a dispersal. Over the next 5 years, surviving family members quietly sold off ancestral farms, deeds transferred through shell buyers. Some properties were subdivided, others were demolished entirely. One historic homestead that had hosted 5 generations of twin marriages was reduced to bare soil within 3 weeks of purchase. No preservation orders were filed. No protests occurred. The land simply vanished from the map. Those who survived were scattered. Some entered psychiatric long-term care under changed names. Others were absorbed into distant relatives outside the Covenant line. A few disappeared completely. Social workers later testified that several former members showed extreme anxiety when asked to speak using I instead of we. Individual identity, for many of them, felt foreign, even dangerous. The psychological fallout was as severe as the biological one. Survivors exhibited profound separation trauma. Many reported persistent phantom sensations, feeling limbs that were not their own, pain without injury, emotional responses that did not align with their surroundings. Therapy records described it as grief without a single body to grieve. Several patients attempted to reunite with twins who had already died. One man traveled repeatedly to the same cemetery in Lancaster County, convinced his brother was beneath a grave marked with another family's name. He spent 3 years trying to dig at the site before being institutionalized. Publicly, the story never broke in full. Why? Because exposing the Covenant would have meant exposing everyone who failed to stop. The church elders who had ignored warning signs, doctors who suspected but stayed silent, county officials who dismissed reports to avoid conflict with religious communities. Even state agencies had record gaps that suggested willful avoidance. Admitting the full truth would have triggered lawsuits stretching back generations. So the narrative was softened. Medical cases were filed independently. Genetic anomalies were categorized as rare familial disorders. The connection between families was never formally acknowledged in any public forum. Academic papers referred only to an isolated rural gene pool. Names were redacted. Locations were blurred. Only fragments of the truth survive in sealed archives, restricted university databases, and the memories of those who were there. And yet the consequences still echo. In the late 2010s, genetic counselors in Pennsylvania began flagging patients who showed markers previously linked to the Covenant line. Some had no idea of their ancestry. Their grandparents had fled decades earlier. Their surnames had changed. Their family stories had been rewritten. But the blood remembered. Doctors began advising against biological reproduction in certain cases due to elevated risks of neurological inheritance. For descendants who believed the Covenant had ended with their parents, the discovery was devastating. The experiment they never consented to had followed them into the future. The land itself carries the silence. Drive through certain stretches of Lancaster County today and you'll pass properties with no markers, no signs, no recorded history, land that appears to have simply reset. Locals rarely speak about the families that once lived there. When pressed, some will say only they kept to themselves. That's all. Even now, rumors persist. Some believe that a few pairs of the 13th generation survived and quietly continued the tradition, in other states under new identities. Others believe the Covenant truly died in those final neurological collapses. No official database can confirm either claim. What is certain is this: when the Twin Covenant finally unraveled, it left behind no monuments, no confessions, no public reckoning, only damaged lives, buried records, and a genetic warning written into human code. And in the final minutes of this story, what remains is not only the tragedy itself, but the question of what it reveals about human belief, control, and the dangerous temptation to redesign nature in our own image. The Twin Covenant did not end with a single dramatic collapse. There was no final courtroom confession, no public admission of guilt, no official apology. It ended the way many long-running human tragedies do, quietly, behind closed doors, beneath layers of paperwork and rewritten history. A system that lasted more than 3 centuries slipped out of sight, almost without a sound. What remains today is not a living bloodline, but a warning. For 13 generations, human beings believed they could redesign nature using faith as justification and tradition as protection. They believed that perfection could be engineered if they were disciplined enough, obedient enough, devoted enough. And for a long time it appeared to work. Twins were born. Lineages continued. The Covenant survived wars, revolutions, and modern medicine. But survival was never the same as success. Because in the end, the cost was individuality. The children of the Covenant were not raised to discover who they were. They were raised to mirror someone else. They did not learn independence. They learned proximity. Their lives were not shaped by choice but by assignment. Love was arranged. Identity was shared. Even suffering was synchronized. And when the blood finally reached its limit, when variation disappeared, when difference was bred out completely, life itself could no longer sustain the system. The Covenant did not die from attack. It died from sameness. This story is not just about twins or genetics or isolated religious communities. It is about what happens when belief becomes absolute, when tradition becomes law, when control disguises itself as devotion. Again and again, history shows us that the most dangerous experiments are not always carried out in laboratories. Sometimes they take place in homes, in churches, in families, hidden behind the idea that something is being done for the greater good. Some doors once opened cannot be quietly closed. Even today, fragments of this story remain sealed in archives, locked behind legal barriers, protected by institutions that failed to act when it mattered most. And while we may never know every name, every grave, or every vanished life connected to the Twin Covenant, the evidence that survives is enough to tell us one thing with certainty. This was not an accident of nature. It was a human decision, repeated until it became irreversible. And that is what makes it truly terrifying. Now I want to hear from you. If you discovered that your family had been part of something like this for generations, would you want to know the truth? Or would you choose to leave the past buried? What is the darkest family secret you've ever heard of? And most importantly, what state are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments. If this story gripped you, make sure you're subscribed. We uncover the hidden histories most people were never meant to find. And in our next episode, we'll explore another sealed chapter where belief crossed the line into something far more dangerous. Because the past is never as silent as they want us to believe.